The Decisive Battles series has traced 6 battles across 6 continents: a conspiracy in Bengal, a highland victory in Ethiopia, a naval catastrophe in the Sea of Japan, a bicycle logistics triumph in Vietnam, a one-hour naval engagement off Chile, and a border conflict on a Mongolian river. The series finale closes with the battle that connects most directly to one of the 20th century's most consequential systems of governance: apartheid. Majuba Hill, in 1881, gave a small group of Boer farmers the confidence that 18 years and one gold discovery later produced a war, a set of concentration camps, and a political union whose institutional architecture would eventually produce one of history's most thoroughly documented systems of racial separation. The First Anglo-Boer War, fought between December 1880 and March 1881, arose from Britain's 1877 annexation of the Transvaal Republic, a Boer state that had been independently governed by Afrikaner settlers since the Great Trek of the 1830s, when Boer farmers migrated inland from the British-controlled Cape Colony to escape British administration, and in many cases, British abolition of slavery. The Transvaal Boers, under leaders including Paul Kruger, rejected British annexation and declared restored independence in December 1880, beginning a brief war in which British forces suffered a consistent string of defeats: at Bronkhorstspruit in December, at Lane's Neck in January, and at the Battle of Ingogo later in January, establishing the specific pattern of British tactical failure that Majuba Hill would complete most decisively. Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley occupied Majuba Hill on the night of February 26 to 27, 1881, with approximately 405 British troops, believing that seizing the dominant high ground overlooking Boer positions below would demonstrate British military superiority and potentially compel a negotiated settlement favorable to Britain. The specific tactical theory reflected conventional 19th-century European military doctrine. Control of elevated terrain provided decisive observational and firepower advantages. The specific flaw in this theory, as the Boers would demonstrate within hours, was that it assumed the defenders of high ground would simply hold static defensive positions rather than actively contest the approach using the specific marksmanship and fieldcraft skills that generations of frontier hunting and conflict with indigenous African societies had given Boer farmers. The Boer response, organized under the field command of Nicolala Smit, involved small groups of mounted riflemen using individual cover, concealment, and accurate long-range marksmanship to advance up the hill's slopes in a methodical fire and movement assault that exploited every fold and feature of the terrain. The Boers' specific tactical advantage, honed through generations of hunting large African game and through frontier conflicts that rewarded individual marksmanship and battlefield initiative over formal parade ground discipline, allowed them to inflict casualties on the exposed British positions while suffering minimal losses themselves. By the time British defenders realized the scale of the Boer advance, the attackers had reached positions close enough to overwhelm the hilltop garrison directly. General Colley was killed by a single shot during the battle's final phase, and the British garrison broke and fled down the hill's reverse slope in disorder. The specific scale of the British defeat at Majuba Hill, approximately 92 killed, including the British commanding general, approximately 134 wounded or captured, against Boer casualties numbering as few as 1 to 6 killed across various historical accounts, represented one of the most lopsided tactical defeats any British colonial army suffered in the 19th century relative to the forces engaged. The death of a serving British general in action was itself an event of considerable shock to British public and political opinion, which had not anticipated that a war against what British press coverage had often characterized as an undisciplined farmer militia could produce such a catastrophic and humiliating outcome. The specific combination of military humiliation and mounting political and financial cost convinced Prime Minister William Gladstone's government, already disinclined toward expensive and unpopular colonial military commitments, to pursue a negotiated settlement rather than continue the war to a more decisive military conclusion. The Pretoria Convention of August 1881, negotiated in the aftermath of Majuba Hill, restored self-government to the Transvaal Republic under a specific arrangement of British suzerainty, a deliberately ambiguous legal status that preserved a notional British overlordship while granting the Boers effective internal self-rule. The settlement was widely interpreted, particularly within Boer political culture, and subsequently reinforced through the more complete independence confirmed by the 1884 London Convention, as a victory achieved specifically through military resistance. Britain had been compelled to grant concessions it would not otherwise have offered. by a hilltop defeat that established Boer fighting capability as a credible deterrent against future British annexation attempts. The specific psychological consequence of this settlement, more than its precise legal terms, became the foundational political asset that Boer leadership would draw upon for the next 2 decades. The discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand Ridge in the Transvaal in 1886, 5 years after Majuba Hill's settlement had restored Transvaal self-government, transformed the entire strategic calculation underlying the relationship between Britain and the Boer republics. The Witwatersrand deposits proved to be among the largest gold reserves ever discovered, and the resulting development of Johannesburg and the broader Transvaal mining economy produced a massive influx of foreign mining capital, equipment, and personnel, predominantly British and other European immigrants known as Uitlanders, who rapidly outnumbered the Boer population in the mining districts while remaining politically disenfranchised under Transvaal law. The specific economic transformation meant that the small agricultural republic Britain had grudgingly allowed to remain self-governing after Majuba was now sitting atop the most valuable mineral deposit in the British Empire's commercial sphere of interest. The Second Anglo-Boer War, beginning in October 1899, was fought substantially over the political and economic control of the gold-rich Transvaal, with the specific immediate trigger being the disenfranchised Uitlander population's grievances and Britain's escalating demands for political rights for these immigrants' demands that Boer leadership under President Paul Kruger viewed correctly as a pretext for eventual British annexation of the goldfields. The Boer leadership's willingness to confront Britain again, despite Britain's now far more substantial military commitment to the conflict than in 1881, traced directly to the specific confidence Majuba Hill had established. The documented historical memory that Boer marksmanship, mobility, and terrain knowledge had defeated British conventional forces once before, and could plausibly do so again. The Second Boer War would prove far longer, far larger, and far more costly than the Boer leadership's Majuba-informed confidence had anticipated. The Second Anglo-Boer War's most severe humanitarian consequence was the British concentration camp system, established specifically as a counterinsurgency response to Boer guerrilla tactics, that drawing on the same mobility, marksmanship, and terrain exploitation that had won at Majuba, proved extremely difficult for conventional British forces to defeat decisively, even after the fall of the major Boer cities. British forces, under the scorched earth policy implemented by Lord Kitchener, systematically destroyed Boer farms and forcibly relocated Boer civilians, predominantly women, children, and elderly people, since adult men were generally fighting with the commandos, into camps where inadequate sanitation, food supply, and medical care produced catastrophic mortality. An estimated 26,000 Boer civilians, the overwhelming majority of them children under 16, died in these camps, primarily from disease. The British concentration camp system also interned an estimated 115,000 black African civilians in separate camps, where mortality is estimated at between 20,000 and 28,000 deaths, a death toll that received substantially less contemporary attention, less subsequent historical documentation, and less resourcing even within the camp system itself compared to the Boer camps, reflecting the racial hierarchy that characterized both British and Boer colonial society at the time. Black South Africans served on both sides of the conflict in various support and combat roles, but their wartime suffering and mortality has been systematically underrepresented in the historical narrative of the Boer War, which has conventionally been told primarily as a conflict between white British and white Boer society. The series notes this specific historiographical gap as part of its honest accounting of the war's full human cost. The Second Anglo-Boer War's political resolution, the Treaty of Vereeniging in 1902, which ended Boer independence and incorporated the Transvaal and Orange Free State into the British Empire, was followed 8 years later by the Union of South Africa in 1910, which united the former Boer republics with the British colonies of the Cape and Natal into a single self-governing dominion. The specific political settlement underlying this union, negotiated substantially between British colonial administrators and Boer political leadership, including former Boer War commanders Louis Botha and Jan Smuts, deliberately excluded black-colored and Indian South Africans from full political participation in the new union's constitutional structure, despite these communities representing the substantial majority of the country's population. This specific compromise, reconciling British and Boer political interests at the direct expense of African political rights, established the foundational institutional architecture of racial exclusion, upon which subsequent South African governance would build. The specific legislative and institutional steps from the Union's 1910 foundation to apartheid's formal establishment in 1948 are well documented. The Natives Land Act of 1913 restricted African land ownership to a small fraction of South African territory. Subsequent legislation progressively restricted African political representation, freedom of movement, and labor rights. And the 1948 election victory of the National Party, campaigning explicitly on a platform of formalized racial separation, produced the comprehensive legal architecture of apartheid that would govern South Africa until 1994. The direct documented chain, Majuba's confidence to the Second Boer War, to the Union's exclusionary founding compromise, to progressive legislative restriction to formal apartheid, represents the most extended and most consequential causal sequence traced in this entire series. Spanning 67 years from the hilltop battle to the system it helped produce. Majuba Hill's specific contribution to the Decisive Battle series, as its concluding episode, completes the series' developing analytical framework with its most consequential demonstration: a battle's psychological legacy. The specific confidence or trauma it instills in a population can produce historical consequences that exceed the battle's immediate military or territorial outcome by orders of magnitude, persisting across generations and producing institutional structures the original combatants never imagined. Plassey was decided by conspiracy. Adwa changed global political possibility. Tsushima produced contradictory legacies. Dien Bien Phu was decided by logistics innovation. Angamos determined resource ownership across resource eras. Khalkhin Gol closed off a strategic alternative. Majuba Hill demonstrates the series' most complete lesson: a battle's psychological aftermath can become the foundational confidence of a political movement, and that movement's subsequent choices can produce institutional consequences spanning generations. The contemporary relevance of Majuba Hill's legacy in 2026 is direct and ongoing. South Africa's post-apartheid political and economic life continues to grapple with the institutional and economic structures that the chain from Majuba through the Union of South Africa established, including land ownership patterns that trace substantially to the Natives Land Act, economic inequality patterns that trace substantially to apartheid-era labor and education restrictions, and the specific ongoing political debate within South Africa about land reform, reparations, and reconciliation that directly engages this history. The battle that almost nobody outside specialist military history circles has been taught is, in a very real sense, still being argued about in South African parliamentary debates, land reform policy discussions, and reconciliation processes in 2026. The Decisive Battles Nobody Taught You series has traced 7 battles whose consequences exceeded their public recognition by extraordinary margins. Plassey gave Britain a subcontinent through conspiracy rather than conquest. Adwa proved European armies could be defeated and inspired anti-colonial movements across 3 continents. Tsushima ended a myth of racial military superiority while simultaneously enabling a new colonialism. Dien Bien Phu's bicycle logistics ended French Indochina and produced the Vietnam War. Angamos decided in 1 hour who would control 3 successive centuries of resource wealth. Khalkhin Gol redirected the Second World War's entire Pacific and Eastern Front trajectory by closing off a strategic alternative. And Majuba Hill's psychological legacy produced, across 67 documented years, the institutional foundations of apartheid: 7 battles, 7 continents and theaters. One consistent lesson: the history that shapes the present is rarely the history that gets taught. 2 hours on a hilltop, 92 British dead, including a general. As few as 1 Boer dead, a peace settlement that became a founding myth. 5 years until gold changed everything. 18 years until the confidence was tested at a scale nobody anticipated. 26,000 Boer civilians dead in concentration camps. 20,000 to 28,000 Black African civilians dead in camps. History paid less attention to. A union built on exclusion. A land act. A national party victory. Apartheid, formally established 67 years after the hilltop, still being debated in Parliament 145 years later. This is where the series Decisive Battles Nobody Taught You concludes. 7 battles, 7 continents. 1 argument completed. History in progress continues. New series, new episodes, the same commitment to primary sources, documented evidence, and the honest examination of consequences that exceed what any battle's combatants could have anticipated. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. The hill is quiet now. The consequences are still running. The series is complete. The history is not.